Sure, it has been a very, very busy week with lots of activity in the news front, from the British Prime Minister Theresa May's visit to South Africa to the Constitutional Court yesterday ordering the South African Social Security Agency and its former acting CEO, Bhengu, to pay in their official capacity the costs of a court application in February seeking extension of the Cash Paymaster Services contract to distribute social grants. So in studio with us, political analyst TK Pooe is here to revisit some of the stories that made the headlines this week. Our heads are spinning, TK. It is just insane. And we still got a long way to go to the election. So it's only going to get more hectic, isn't it?
And more confusing.
and more confusing. That's why you're here, to try and explain it to all of us. Let's start off with Theresa May. So we had her visiting South Africa. She's on a charm offensive ahead of Brexit. And this was a great opportunity for South Africa to step up and shine and sort of almost take the lead in some form of negotiation. How did you think this all went?
I think it was, like you're saying, it was a charm offensive. But what I needed to see was the issue of saying, what is our plan? Which goes back to South Africa really doesn't have an economic development policy. I like the fact that you said we could take the lead. If you look at the issue of what happened with MTN, a lot of investors now understand that, listen, in order for you to really get the gateway into Africa, you need South Africa. But the key question needs to be, are our institutions ready and is government ready to lead such an investment? The UK wants to put in something like 70 billion leading up to 2022. Now the key question is, would we be able to take enough of that money and also lead them into the rest of the continent? And at the moment, I think it's still a bit blurry where we stand with that.
Yeah. Also, the issue of land coming up in the conversation too. So we saw the position of US President Donald Trump, and that was last week. Now, this week, Theresa May is here. Her reaction, kind of, you do it legally, it's fine.
I think it shows the position of Britain vis-a-vis what's happening with them leaving Brexit. They said, provided it goes through the legal and the normal channels. Some people always argue that, listen, that's always been the provision in the Constitution. But the key thing will need to be, how do we now sell it? Because I think that it's a key thing that the President and South African government needs to look internationally. How do you sell this issue of expropriation without compensation? I think it's great that the UK is, in a way, conceding the fact that we're not going to get involved, provided that, look, it looks well, it plays well to the cameras internationally. Trump is, I think the Japanese have found a way to actually deal with him, which is to say, you listen, you nod your head, but then you go on and do your own thing.
Yeah. I think that's a good idea. I think it's a very, very good idea. Okay, the commission. Now, we've got two commissions at the moment. So let's start off with the State Capture Commission, because we've seen a lot of bombshells being dropped this week, and a lot has been said. So let's start off with Fakkie Mentor. She was the first to go and give her testimony in front of the commission. What did you make of her, firstly, as a witness and some of the things she was saying?
Well, I think as a witness, what was very dramatic to see, if you look at her past, let's say, questions and how she's actually come across, she was more confident. With this one, there was that issue of, she looked a bit fearful, a bit scared, as though the confidence was not there. But I guess maybe to tie in the two commissions together, it's an issue of saying, I'm still a bit dubious as to why would you not go through the proper legal channels. That people need to understand the commission actually doesn't have legal bite. You're basically just trying to find out what's happening. And I think that's a bit, I think makes things worse. It looks worse that the fact that we all know that what was happening. If you listen to Fakkie Mentor's issues about how the president would circumvent certain processes to allow friends to come in, it's a bit disconcerting if you're a citizen.
Yeah, it's very disconcerting. I mean, it truly is, listening to these stories. However, what did you make of her as a witness? Because a lot of people were questioning her and sort of saying, look, she seemed a little bit sketchy on some details. She sort of was a little bit all over the place. But if, can we take that seriously, or what she was actually saying sort of overrode her behavioral techniques during this?
This is where I would have preferred to go through the legal and means of process. If I was a lawyer and advocate, I think I would have taken advantage of the fact that how do you miss names? I mean, how do you miss, I thought this was an X person, this is Y person. So for me, it's an issue of saying, was it the issue that the cameras got to her? Was it the fact that she wasn't well briefed by legal counsel? And I think this is what takes away from what commissions are supposed to be about. And I would have preferred had she really just gone through had we made this a proper legal inquiry where there's actual repercussions, where she would have had to really practice and know which surname which is attached to this person. Because for me, it takes away, and it just really gives, if you're the lawyer who's now going to have to go through the legal process, I think you can just go back to this footage and say, how can you trust this witness?
This is the problem. Yeah. This is the problem. And this is a lot of money and a lot of time being spent on this commission. Themba Maseko, obviously coming out and saying a lot. I mean, there was a lot to take away from what he was saying. But what sort of really grabbed your attention on this one?
The fact that you can be fired while being in a meeting representing government.
Unbelievable.
That for me just says to me that, listen, the key thing is outsourcing of corruption. The fact that, if you had to look this using a policy means, the president's hand was, you cannot say where his hand was, but you felt his effect. And for me, the fact that how can you be fired and not know? Your staff has to call you. So for me, that really is the most frightening thing. The fact that there are people at the moment who have seen what's happened to Mr. Maseko. And as he said, people are actually not willing to come forward, which tells me the environment is not yet ready to acknowledge that we had something very bad happen, which is this issue of, I think, grand corruption, which is just called state of capture in South Africa. And that for me is very sad. And
it is. I mean, it's something that Sakina and myself were talking about a bit earlier about we haven't seen ministers coming forward. We haven't gotten to the bottom of what's actually been going on. And I mean, there were a lot more role players, but it doesn't seem to be the fact that people want to come forward and want to talk about this.
And this again goes back to the fact that this is not something which people are compelled to do. And what you're going to do close to the 2019 election, if you're the government, would you honestly want people who are going to be campaigning's faces to be attached to this issue? And I think that speaks to the fact that maybe we should be very honest and say corruption is not really taken very serious amongst our government. It's an issue which is a political football. If you're not happy with somebody, instead of playing them, you just say corruption. And until we see people actually go to jail, until we see ministers account, for me, I think I think for us it's great TV drama, but for the rest of the population, for the money which has just been siphoned off, which we don't know if we're ever going to get back, it's actually quite sad.
Yeah, very much so. Talking about money that we're never going to get back. Let's look at the SARS Commission now. The Commission getting rid of skilled people, one person testifying that she was getting paid for not doing anything. Talk to me about this Commission, because this was also a big week for the Commission.
It speaks to the degradation that happened within institutions over the last 10 years. SARS used to be one of the few shining lights in government. It used to be the institution we all had trust in. If you and I owe money, we know that, we had to get our house in order towards SARS. But what this is saying to me is the damage that was done by the previous regime, which is still the National Government Party, is still, it really scares with the fact that how do you go about purposefully destroying an institution, and then how do you rope in other agencies, legitimate consulting firms like your Bain and Company, to actually help you in doing this? This speaks to the fact that there's a cobweb of it's a whole web of deceit, where you have government, you have sometimes the private sector, you have certain individuals, and if the aim is really to make money, they don't care who they destroy. And how can you as a now citizen actually feel as though my money is going towards a safe institution? Because the key issue is SARS is still not yet at the level we need it to be.
Yeah, that's true. I'd like to go a bit deeper, but we just don't have time because there's so much to get through. But I want to talk about what happened yesterday with Tshwane Mayor Solly Msimanga. But if we can couple that with what happened also in Nelson Mandela Bay. We've seen the back of Athol Trollip now. That was something that took us all by surprise. Solly is still in that seat. What is going on? What is going on in these coalition governments?
A lot of South Africans spoke about they want to see a coalition government. I've always argued, well, South Africa, this is a coalition government where the small party has a lot of the say and the big two parties will dance to their tune. And I think it really raises the issue of saying in all this political intrigue and drama, the days of our lives as it's happening, where are people, where are the ordinary citizens going to really, where is the issue of service delivery? I think it speaks to the fact that both parties are now, in a way, beholden to the EFF. But the key question I always ask is, how does this actually help South Africa? And if you live in Tshwane, if you're a citizen of whichever metro municipality you work with, how does this actually help me in my day-to-day living? Because I think it's as though there's a political elite which is playing their own political game towards 2019. And you and I, we just happen to be people who are just watching it on TV. And I think South Africans should be very wary when they say you want an issue of a coalition. My argument has always been, if you look at public policy, what you actually need is a government that has a vision and an administrator that carries it out. To have a coalition means you're going to have this day to day. Now, we looked at how the stock exchange was happening. If you had to maybe project this onto a national level, if this was, let's say, a motion of no confidence in a certain president at a national level, how would the market react to that?
Indeed.
And I think that's how we need to really look at coalition. It's not a great thing to have a coalition.
No.
It just basically means that there's no leader, and in the interim, people will just play their games, and you and I just happen to be happenstance.
Yeah, and at the moment, this is a game. It is playing a game right now. I mean, you've got newspapers guessing. We looked at two newspapers this morning. You've got the Sowetans saying that the DA and the EFF look like they're about to get a deal going and join hands together. And then in another newspaper, you've got the EFF and the ANC with Cyril Ramaphosa and Julius Malema on the front page in the middle of a heart. I mean, how do we know what's going on, especially in these coalitions and what's happening behind closed doors? It's almost impossible to predict.
It is impossible, and I would say as a policy person, we don't do guesses. What we work with is fact and what's happened. And I think for most South Africans, we're at that level where, listen, we just want the economy to go well. And if we have to be left to be guessing, you just also have to imagine what's happening within the political parties. Because the only thing we know for sure, and I think we can really put our money into this, is that the EFF is in control of both parties' direction, and both parties are going towards the throne of Julius Malema and saying, what can we give you in exchange for your support? And I think that's the only thing we know at the moment.
Unbelievable. What a powerful position to be in. A little bit too powerful, I think. Finally, I want to wrap up what the big story, I think, this week that we were looking at. I mean, there've been so many. We haven't spoken about the Deputy President in Parliament, and we also, we sort of need to, unfortunately, wrap up with looking at the violence in Soweto and the looting in the shops that took place there. 3 people lost their lives, another individual in a very critical condition. What did you make of that?
I think it's an issue where South Africa needs to start having a real conversation about what do we understand by migration. And I think going back to the first story of Brexit, there is a move around the world. This is not unique. The violence is unfortunate, and it's what makes South Africa very unique. But there is a move around the world where people are starting to ask who qualifies to be a citizen and what does that entail. South Africa going into 1994, my argument has always been, was too liberal with what it means to be a migrant. We all understand that there's a migrant for political asylum, and no one can have an argument against that. But what we have in South Africa, and especially in township, is the issue of economic migrants. And now that's a position which we really are not very clear on. It cannot be denied if you look on the continent that you only have to look at Nigeria when it got its independence. It actually made that argument that, listen, we cannot have so many Ghanaians in South Africa, so that's not the unique position. What we need to ask going forward is, can we honestly ignore the plight of people in the township when they argue that there's too many foreign nationals for business purposes? And I know it's an uncomfortable argument to have,
very uncomfortable,
but it's an international conversation which is happening. And what tends to happen with is that if policymakers are ignoring people at the ground, this is going to happen. We don't want the violence. That's very unfortunate. It should not happen in any way. Even if you're angry, violence should not be what you turn to. But the question needs to be, is it not now time to maybe consider what we understand by who we bring across the border and why we bring them here? It's going to be uncomfortable, and it's going to have maybe touches of xenophobia, but it's an issue where if you as a government do not take that lead, the local people will take it forward, and what we don't want is the violence that happened in Soweto.
Okay, TK, we leave it there. Thank you very, very much for talking to us, going through some of the big stories of the week. Political analyst TK Pooe, and those were the big headlines. Let's take a break, and when we return, we'll bring you up to speed with today's news at 7.